Hi, we're going to be looking at a Chevy Cobalt today and do an evaporative emissions diagnostic on it. This car has been sent to me by a local used car dealer. They don't do a lot of the diagnostics. I do the diagnostics for them and then they do the repairs. On this particular vehicle, we have a evaporative emissions code that is being set. Now this is setting at P0446 for canister vent valve performance. And as you're going to see as I just show you some of the data, there's more than one thing going on with this car with the evaporative emissions. Let's go see what codes are setting in this car. So first thing we're going to do is just go to an automatic selection. I'm going to read the VIN number. And that comes up, so we'll tell it OK. It's going to decode the VIN and identify the vehicle. And this always takes a few seconds. So let's go into diagnostics. And it's here for a check engine light. But let's go with an all module scan so that we have a solid idea of what actually is going on with the car. This is going to take a few moments, so I'll let it run. Okay, so the scan's been completed and there are quite a few codes in a number of modules. Now one of the things we can do, because we've taken this information all at once, is we're going to go to the report button on the bottom of the screen and get a summary of all of the different codes. And let's see, engine controls, we got one fault, engine cooling one, engine electrical, 4 of them, anti-lock brake system, body control module. As we scroll up, HVAC has 3 codes, 2 in the shift block, 3 in the cruise, 4 in the entertainment system. And you got to ask yourself, how important is it to capture all of these codes the first time before you do any work? So here's our first code of P0446, and this is evaporative emissions vent system performance. And there you can see that the code is repeated in the engine cooling. Engine electrical has 4 codes. We repeat the same code. We've got fewer controllers on the bus than programmed. It's passed on this ignition. It has failed sometime in the past as a history code. 39151, that is right rear turn signal, short to battery or open. We have the same evaporative emissions code showing up. Fewer controllers on the bus. Okay, body computer. And now we've actually got a different code set up in the body computer, the 2100, the U2100-00 for a CAN bus communication. And as we keep rolling through, we keep seeing the same codes repeated. Option configuration error in this one. This is the entertainment system. And again, that was a history code. Now, one of the places you should always go, we're going to escape from here. Let's just go right into our engine controls module. So we're just going to go straight into there. And let's go to the freeze frame for that code. We're going to capture the freeze frame data. This is going to show us the conditions that the failure is occurring under. It's been happening for some 3,100 miles, so this car has been broke for a while and it just never was repaired. It was an open loop, and I'll just scroll through this a little bit. Always be in the habit of storing this information. So we can hit record, and it's capturing this for me. And we only need to capture it for a few seconds, and then I'll be able to save it and then use that a little later. And then we can stop it. So now let's return. Okay, so we got a code, a P0446, canister vent valve performance. One of the things that every technician needs to do is when you retrieve a trouble code like this, your first duty is to find out how did the computer run the test, and then you've got to figure out how can you test the same way that the computer did. Let's go and see how this system's actually performing. So we're going to escape here. Let's go into live data, engine control module. I can select specific data groups already. Let's just go straight to evaporative emissions. This is actually an important step. One of the first things to take a look at is what does the computer think it sees as far as the actual fuel tank pressure. So here we've got fuel tank pressure sensor 1.28 and fuel tank pressure sensor 1.37 volts. So this is millimeters of mercury. This is voltage, and it should be reading atmospheric pressure right now. On a GM sensor, 1.5 volts would be atmospheric pressure. As the voltage goes down, that means we've got pressure in the system as far as the computer is concerned. Well, the car's sitting there, engine off. Take a look and see. Evap vent solenoid says that it's venting, so it should be at atmospheric pressure. Now, there's a possibility. Could it have pressure trapped in it? So here we are on the live data screen. We've been watching the fuel tank pressure sensor voltage and reported pressure change, even though the engine's not running and the vent solenoid is venting. I'm going to start the vehicle up, and let's see what happens to the vacuum or pressure inside the fuel tank. Okay, so we're running, and I want you to take a look at the purge solenoid command up here at the top. We are at 0% at this point. So what we need to do now is wait until the PCM commands the purge valve on, or we can go back to the bidirectional controls and we can command it on ourselves. So here we are back at the menu screen. Let's go into active test, engine, and vent solenoid, purge solenoid. Let's select that. And notice this is giving me some good data. We've got our fuel tank pressure sensor down here, and we can command the purge valve to turn on. So let's go ahead and command it on. And what do you think should happen to the vacuum in the tank? Too strong a vacuum. Let's escape. If you take a look, I just got back in and we're bleeding that off, so we aborted the test. The canister vent valve was open the entire time. It was venting. Let me do this again. You can see that we're venting. You can see our fuel tank pressure. Try to position it. Let's bring this up. We're only going to come up to about 30%. See the fuel tank pressure rising? Let's just decrease again. With this vent valve open, we shouldn't be pulling that much of a vacuum. Notice how long it takes to bleed off. So we've already seen that the fuel tank pressure sensor is erratic, but let's see if there's actually another failure going on with this car. I'm going to turn this on, and then I'm going to go over to the car and I'm going to take the fuel cap off. So let's come up to about 20%, and you can see that we're already starting to build vacuum. And now I've taken the fuel cap off. And what's happening inside the tank? Vacuum dropped, didn't it? I'm going to put the fuel cap back on. And as soon as I put the fuel cap back on, you can see that the vacuum is increasing. And we're coming up 6 millimeter mercury, but should we really be pulling this much vacuum? Look at our fuel tank pressure sensor voltage, 2.39 volts, 2.4 volts. That's too high for only a 20% command. If I come up a little bit more, let's come up to a 40%, and then I'm going to go open up cap again. Notice with the fuel cap off, you don't have any vacuum building up in the tank. I'll put the fuel cap back on. And instantly you see the vacuum building back up. So let's escape. When I do an evaporative emissions class, one of the things that I talk about is my normal routine. When I have a leak code, one of the first things I do on a GM vehicle is confirm whether or not the canister vent valve works correctly or not. In this particular case, because the code isn't a leak, it's actually a performance code for the vent valve, I modify my routine. I want to gather data just like you've just seen first, and now let's go to the vent solenoid and test it and see what it can actually do in the bidirectional controls. You can clearly hear the vent valve opening and closing. Let's go to the canister purge and seal test. With this test, I'll have to have the engine running. We're going to command the vent solenoid closed. We'll turn on the purge valve, pull a certain amount of vacuum, turn the purge valve off. Well, then the real trick is when I command the vent valve off, what happens to the vacuum? Okay, now with the car running again, I'm going to go ahead and tell this okay. And now we increase the purge valve. And you can see the vacuum building. And now we just system seal. That turns the purge valve off, and we watch the vacuum. This would be the small leak test. You can see the vacuum is bleeding off very slowly. Now when I hit escape, the vent valve should turn off. And let's see what happened to the vacuum. And I had to go back in, but you can see that it turned and we lost the vacuum, which is where we should be. We should have lost the vacuum with the vent valve commanded back open. Okay, the car's just sitting there idling, and it's under normal control from the PCM. You can see our purge solenoid commands about 13%, and I want you to take a peek here at fuel tank pressure, -3 millimeter of mercury. We're at 1.8 volts from the fuel tank pressure sensor. Under a normal venting condition, when you start getting over 1.8 volts on a GM, you got to start questioning whether something is wrong or not. It's okay for it to pull a slight vacuum while you're purging. The natural restriction of the vent valve and the canister is going to do that. 1.8 volts starts to get a little questionable as far as whether that's too much of a restriction or not. And here we are at 1.86. if you remember when I did the manual test a little bit ago, I went to a 20% command and you saw the vacuum building much higher than that. We were getting 7, 8 millimeter of mercury. And by the way, 8 millimeter of mercury is about 4 inches of water. Okay, now that you've seen some of the data, the question is, how exactly does the computer run the test to decide whether the vent valve is working correctly or not? And this is something that we discuss a lot when we do our vapor emissions class. The first phase of the test the computer runs is the large leak test, and they essentially close the canister vent valve, turn on the purge valve, and pull a vacuum into the tank in the canister. That vacuum that is being pulled, if it fails to reach a specific value within a certain amount of time, then the computer is going to judge that as being a large leak. In this case, that portion of the test passes. Once that passes and you've pulled a strong enough vacuum, the next thing the computer does is it turns off the purge valve, leaving the vent valve turned on, and now it watches the vacuum bleed off. Now this is one of the older cars, so it's not doing the natural vapor leak detection routine. Cars that actually test themselves for the small leak when the car is turned off after all the tests have run, they're going to approach this a little differently. Even if it was a car that does the NVLD test, our diagnostic routine doesn't actually have to change. We can still do the bleed off test for the small leak just like we always have, and then manipulate parts of the car in order to do our diagnostics. Essentially, if I'm watching the vacuum bleed off, I can just simply reach up and block off the vent valve, block off the filler neck, or both as required. And when I block off the correct portion of the system, the vacuum will slow down. It'll stop bleeding off. After the small leak test completes, and we've maintained vacuum for a long enough period of time, the next thing the computer does is it commands the vent valve to turn off. That should open up the canister in the tank to atmospheric pressure, and the vacuum that was trapped should bleed off. If it fails to bleed off fast enough, that is exactly how the computer runs that P0446 test for canister vent valve performance. On this car, we've already seen that the fuel tank pressure sensor isn't accurate. You saw the value drifting, key on, engine off. Can you really trust that that test ran accurately with that fuel tank pressure sensor being questionable? And the answer, of course, is no. You're going to reach a point where you're going to have to decide, do we need to get that value corrected and then retest, or do you have an alternative? One of my favorite routines is to see if I can manipulate the situation to gather some information that might otherwise not be readily available. Here we've got a question about how accurate the fuel tank pressure sensor is. Well, what I've got in my hand right here is a little gauge that I can actually attach to the vehicle. I can tee this in, and then this can give me a reference as far as how much vacuum is actually in the system. So without actually having to replace that fuel tank pressure sensor right now, I can prove whether or not the rest of the system is operating correctly. Because we already know that we can't trust that sensor. What you just saw me do by taking the fuel cap off and putting it back on is manipulating the system in order to gather some more information. In every diagnostic, there's going to be a point where you've made some type of a discovery which leads to a question. And that question was, how accurate is this fuel tank pressure sensor? And what could I do that could prove whether or not I need airflow above what the canister and the vent valve were actually providing? To see if I needed airflow above what the canister and vent valve were providing. Well, the easiest way to do that is just simply take the fuel cap off. And that gives us another passage for the air to be flowing. And what you saw right away was that the vacuum dropped, proving that there is some type of a restriction in the canister and the vent valve. How much of a restriction still needs to be determined. If it's too much, that could be a problem. Keep in mind, if that was enough of a restriction, What kind of a problem would the customer also have? You kind of ask yourself that question. And the answer is, if it's restricted too much, they're going to have difficulty putting fuel in the car. Well, here's a perfect test that actually lets you check to see if the canister or the vent valve are restricted by just simply commanding the purge valve on with the vent valve off. You bring the duty cycle up, and as you see the system's pulling too much of a vacuum, go ahead and remove the vent valve from the system. Remove the canister. And now you'd have that passage for fresh air unrestricted, and see what kind of a result it creates for you. So when we get a chance, I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll end up removing the vent valve from the canister just to see how much of a restriction the vent valve and the filter are actually creating on this car. Okay, so there's our carbon canister at the back of the car, and as you can see, the canister vent valve is in the canister itself. And that's actually a filter that's underneath this cover right here. Okay, I didn't video what it took to remove the canister vent line from the canister. You can see that the vent line is right here. Here's the nipple for it. And I'm going to repeat my test from earlier. And this time, I can use my finger in order to simulate the vent valve being turned on and off. Now, like I did in the past, I'm going to do the purge and seal. And all I simply need to do is when I hit the increase button, it automatically closes the vent valve, which you heard, and we are pulling a vacuum very quickly. So then I hit system seal, that turns the purge valve off. And we came up to about 12 millimeter of mercury, which would have been about 6 inches of water. And now I can watch the scan tool, and all I would simply need to do is just plug this off with my finger. And if I was testing for a vent valve leak, and this made the system maintain vacuum, then I've got my answer as far as whether the vent valve is leaking or not. Right now we're sitting at 10.21 millimeter mercury. There's 10.03. If I take my finger off, 985, 1003, it's kind of flashing back and forth. It's really not changing the speed that it bleeds the vacuum off at. Again, if the vent valve was leaking, this is all we'd need to do to manipulate the system. Just block it off with my finger. For this next test, I'm simply going to turn on the purge valve, get it to start pulling a vacuum, which right now, even with the hose removed from the canister and the vent valve turned off, our fuel tank pressure sensor is reporting 4.5 millimeter mercury of vacuum in the tank. We got a 14% duty cycle, so actually I don't have to do anything but reach up here and block off the vent hose, and let's see what it does. So with the vent blocked off with my finger, it's immediately pulling a vacuum, and there's 11, there's 12. I let my finger off, so I'll put the camera onto the scan tool and you can watch this happen as I manipulate it. Alright, so here's our scan data, and with the vent valve line removed from the canister, we've got a 14% duty cycle command from the PCM on the canister. All I simply need to do is take my finger, block off the hose that the vent valve would be breathing through, and I can essentially run the test. If you look down here, you can see fuel tank pressure sensor, 4 millimeter of mercury. So now I'm just going to cover up the tube for the vent with my finger, and you instantly see it pulling a vacuum. So there's 11, 11 and a half, 12, 12 and a half. Now I take my finger off, and how quick should the vacuum bleed off? It took it a while, didn't it? And let me show you the voltage that we're actually achieving. my finger back off. This time, I'm going to take the canister vent valve out of the canister. Okay, so I'm going to remove the vent valve from the canister and see what kind of result we get. So it doesn't have to come the whole way out, but now I can rerun the test, and even putting my finger over the vent tube right now doesn't affect the pressure because we're simply going to leak around where the vent valve is installed. So I've just pulled the canister vent valve loose from the canister. How does that look? Now if I take and put my finger over the vent, you can see that I'm not having any impact on the vacuum that is being pulled. I just put the vent valve back in. I'll put my finger over the vent, and you can see that we're pulling a vacuum. Again, this is all about manipulating the system so that you can figure out another way of evaluating the components in the system. The restriction that we do see in the vent system is inside the canister. So just changing a vent valve or just changing a vent filter is not going to have an impact on that. It is in fact the canister itself. Okay, so what you saw was with the vent valve removed from the canister, turning the purge valve on and pulling a vacuum with the purge valve. I was able to pull a strong enough vacuum that the system kicked me out. It exceeded the tolerance that the computer allows. If the canister was actually breathing correctly, it won't do that. It won't kick me out. It would never pull enough of a vacuum through the purge valve in order to exceed that testing level. Now, we can do that with the vent valve sealed up, but with the vent valve unable to seal the canister because I had pulled it part way out, then the only restriction is the canister itself. Now, it's important. I showed you the vacuum gauge that I could actually add to the system. However, in this case, I didn't even have to go that far to confirm the operation of the fuel tank pressure sensor. Because we have seen it being inaccurate, we already know that it's an issue. So the diagnosis on this car is actually that it needs a fuel tank pressure sensor, and it does need the canister because of the restriction that I was actually able to prove in the system.